I am recording. Okay, so this is one of the last topics. There are a few things that we gotta finish up. So we have talked about competition, and we've talked about monopoly. Um, we're gonna talk some more about um, industry structure, but this is kind of a good place to take a little bit of a break, because the last two types of industry structure that we have to talk about are monopolistic competition, which is, I think, pretty straightforward and intuitive. You guys will understand it because most of the goods that are produced in our society are produced in monopolistically competitive industries. And then we'll talk about oligopoly. And oligopoly is one of those topics that's I think this is a little bit challenging, but nevertheless, we'll talk about it. But now we're really in a position to think a little bit more carefully about some of the stuff we talked about in the beginning of the class. And so I like to do this just a little bit before the end too, because it's kind of like um, a review of things that you guys already know something about. So if you really want to think about the class, we've talked about demand and supply from the very beginning of the class. And then we're digging a little bit deeper into the decisions of buyers and sellers, and we talked about government regulation. And now, in particular, we spent the last little while saying, well, okay, when we draw a supply curve, we're assuming that there's a competitive industry behind it, but it may not be a competitive industry. You might end up having the good being supplied by something like a monopolist or one of these other industry structures. And now what we're going to talk about is that in a transaction, there are more than just two parties to the transaction that are affected from a society perspective. So remember that I told you guys at the very beginning of the class that the first half of the class, because we analyzed all of these different government policies like taxes and price ceilings and price floors. We talked a little bit about quotas, and at that stage of the game, if you didn't have an idea coming into this class of what economics was about, and somebody just told you in the hallway, hey, listen, economists are just going to tell you the government's bad. And yeah, that's kind of like the top line, right? We said, well, competitive markets are efficient without the government getting involved. And, if the government taxes or they do some price manipulation to try to keep prices from getting too high or too low, then that'll just cause these deadweight losses. So there's really no role for the government in the first part of this class. But I told you guys, if you remember, I was like, well, in the second half of the class, we'll kind of reintroduce the government as not just the bad guy. And so this chapter is about talking about things that we know that the government can play some role in helping to regulate in the economy in a way that's generally beneficial. But in order to get to that conclusion, we have to say it's not just the buyer and the seller, because in our supply and demand model, the buyer looks out for the buyer. You only buy something if you want to buy it, right? So absent coercion, meaning somebody forcing you to do something, you're just making choices. And there's no role for the government in guiding your choices, at least not in economics, right? And with respect to the seller, the other party to the transaction, again, there's no role for the government. The sellers sell stuff to maximize their profits. They don't need the government to tell them how to do that. So in order for the government to have some constructive or beneficial role, we have to look to parties that are not represented, right? We have to look to somebody besides the buyer and seller and say, well, you know, the buyer decides to buy, the seller decides to sell, and if those are the only two people involved, then there's no role for the government. So if there's a constructive role for the government, it must be that the government represents other people in society that are affected by the transaction. And it turns out that, yeah, there are lots of transactions where you have what we call an external effect. And by external, we mean external to the two primary parties. It doesn't affect the buyer directly, and it doesn't affect the seller directly, but affects other people in society in a way that if you just let the buyer and seller do um, what they would normally do, which is in their best interest, they'll be fine. But other people might be damaged, is sort of our leading example. And the best example I can give you guys at the outset, and there are lots of them, is something like secondhand cigarette smoke, right? So in the case of that transaction, you think about, the smoker. Well, assuming they're a rational adult, they know all the risks of smoking. They decide to smoke anyway, right? They're just buying something they're willing to pay for. That's fine. We don't need the government to protect the smoker, right? The tobacco seller doesn't need the government to protect the tobacco seller. But those parties could transact, and there could still be other people in society with true economic costs. So since smoking has, been banned in most public spaces, you guys don't think about this anymore, but there used to be these stories all the time. So back when I was a kid, it was common to walk into a restaurant and people would be smoking in the restaurant while other people were eating. And so even if your parents didn't smoke or the people you were with didn't smoke, you'd still be exposed to this cigarette smoke. But it wasn't the restaurant goers, it wasn't the patrons of the restaurant that suffered the most. What happened was a lot of times people on the wait staff so the waitresses, the waiters, the busboys, because they were exposed to the cigarette smoke all day long, day after day, a lot of them developed serious lung problems, lung cancer, emphysema, from being in that workplace that had smoke in it all the time. And now, there's in the model that we have right now, there's no place to represent this true cost to society of damaging the health of these third party to the transaction. So they're the third party because it's not one of the two primary parties. It's not the buyer and it's not the seller. So this gives us the opportunity to begin to examine, you know, what about other people in society that are affected by transactions. So we said at the beginning there's this big idea of, markets are efficient, and this was basically the idea of Adam Smith, and he's saying, you know, um, people are self-interested, and that's fine, and they can represent themselves. They don't need anybody else, and you'll get an efficient outcome, as if by an invisible hand. So he's saying it's like the hand of God coordinates economic activity. But market failures can still happen, and what we're talking about market failures, what we mean is the market fails to be efficient. Because remember, that's really our measure. Is the market efficient or is it inefficient? And so it turns out when you have externalities, you can still have inefficiency even without the government or anybody else being involved. So an externality refers to an uncompensated impact of one person's actions on the well-being of a bystander. This is the third party. They're not a buyer, not a seller. And externalities can cause markets to be inefficient and fail to maximize total surplus. Remember, that's producer surplus plus consumer surplus. And in the cases that we have taxes, any tax revenue is also part of total surplus. So how do these externalities generate? Well, when a person engages in an activity that influences the well-being of a bystander, and that bystander and that person aren't transacting in any way, it's no compensation is received for that effect. Um, if it turns out to be a negative impact, like damaging somebody's health due to pollution, like the secondhand cigarette smoke um, example, we call that a negative externality. And it's probably harder for you guys to think about this, but it can also turn out that there can be a third party impact that is beneficial. And that's what we call a positive externality. Now, what's kind of also counterintuitive is that from an economic perspective, since efficiency is the goal, neither negative nor positive externalities help with efficiency. They both cause inefficiencies. So it's not, a lot of people, I think they get to this part of the material and they think, oh, yeah, of course, you want the government or somebody to intervene to stop people from being damaged from, radioactive waste from nuclear power plants, or from, pollution from paper factories or car exhaust or secondhand cigarette smoke. But from an economic perspective, it's just as inefficient and harmful to the economy overall if there are positive externalities in the economy where people are doing things that help others, but they're not compensated for. So this should sort of cement in your mind that something different's going on here. Um, you know, Economics is concerned about economic efficiency. They're not concerned um, with economists aren't concerned with everyday notions of good and bad, of some sense of justice or something like that. No, it's all about efficiency. So let's go ahead and dig into that a little bit more deeply. So we'll talk about, here's some of the common examples we've already mentioned, a lot of them. Negative externalities, automobile exhaust. Well, who's a third party there? Well, if you ride your bicycle back and forth to work every day, you never get in a car, or you just ride public transportation, on trains or subways or something like that, you walk, right? Then you're not involved in the automobile market. You don't buy cars, you don't sell cars, right? But still, that automobile exhaust can damage your health. And I don't know if you guys know. Um, does anybody know how big of a problem car exhaust is in Southern California? If you guys have a comment about this, go ahead and raise your hand. I'd like to chat about it for a minute. Nobody? Um, okay. Chantel, why don't you
So,
have your mic? Yeah.
okay, cool. So I actually just did a paper in one of my geography classes on transportation in California,
Right.
and it's pretty intense on how like big the fuel usage is, I guess you could say, like the pollution
Yeah.
it creates.
Right.
And then like right now they're trying to like figure out like other green emissions to like lower that reduce it, but I don't know. Yeah, that's all I kind of really know about it.
Yeah, well, see, and you know why you don't know about it is because you haven't been alive that long.
That's
So
true.
you know, when I was a kid here in Southern California, I was born in Huntington Park, so go HP. Um, and in Huntington Park, um, and then I lived in Long Beach for a while. I'm the first person in my family in any generation um, to have asthma. And I had asthma as a kid, but there's an epidemic of asthma amongst people in my generation. because the air pollution in Southern California was so bad when I was growing up. I didn't even know there were any mountains in San Bernardino, San Gabriel area. I never seen the mountains. Every once in a while, my parents would take me to the mountains, so I knew they were there that way. But today I go outside and I look across and I can see all the mountains in the San Gabriel mountain range, and behind Pomona, I can see Mount Baldy and stuff like that. You just and you guys probably know what it's like. I mean, there are some days even now you can't see the mountains too well, but it wasn't because of cloud cover, it was because of smog. And so there are lots of people that you know are my age or around my age that remember how bad the pollution was. Even when I was here in the early 1990s, going to Cal State Fullerton, um, I'd go outside to try to like go for a run in the summertime, and the pollution was so bad it would just sting my eyes and burn my skin. Um, so California, Southern California in particular, has done an incredible job of over the course of the last, 30, 40, 50 years cleaning up the air pollution here. And there's lots of regulation. Now we have all this reformulated gasoline. That's why we have some of the highest gas prices in the entire country. It's not because um, gas otherwise would be cheaper, um, because people are willing to pay more here or something like that. It's because our gasoline supply is restricted to gasoline that has special additives so that it will burn more cleanly and cause less pollution. So um, there are a lot of things behind the scenes that people don't realize that are really costly that have improved the air quality in Southern California, and it was all as a result of public health concerns because the pollution was so bad. So, but the point is hopefully really clear that we're all exposed every day to air pollution, a lot less now because nobody's driving. Um, but one of the biggest sources of air pollution right now that you guys probably don't realize, um, but there are higher rates of cancer for people that live within about a mile of a freeway, and that's because the diesel trucks, they have sulfur in the diesel, and what comes out of their exhaust, they call it diesel particulate matter. And so it's these fine particles of sulfur dioxide that are floating around. And when you breathe them in, it turns into sulfuric acid in your lungs. And so if you live within about a mile of like the 91 freeway where there's lots of truck traffic, then you can see that there are higher incidents of cancer as a result of exposure to that diesel particulate matter. So again, even if you're not a transactor in a market for an automobile, you don't buy a car, you don't drive a car, you don't sell cars, you're still exposed to the damage from automobile exhaust. And, externalities include things like, I don't know if you guys heard my dog growling a minute ago, but barking dogs are listed, right? Bothers their neighbors. Loud stereos in apartment buildings. But guys can probably think of lots of things. Basically, what you would call a nuisance or something like that, and then something that annoys you that other people are doing. And particularly, we're interested in what's going on in the markets where these things are transacted. So if you think about the pets, right? You say, well, there's a market for pets, and even if I don't buy a pet, I don't sell a pet. If my neighbor has a barking dog, I still have to bear the cost of that. I don't know. Does anybody have any stories of annoying pets, neighbors, pets? You guys have to have at least one. I want to share one with you guys. Um, any barking dog stories?
I have like cats that come into my yard that aren't mine. That's kind
What
of annoying.
do they leave dead mice on your doorstep or scratch you or anything like that?
No, I've had one, but they like to hiss even though they're in my yard.
Okay, yeah, yeah, it's their yard, right? 'Cause cats don't know that. Yeah, I don't. So there used to be this neighborhood cat that would hang around my house and leave pieces of dead animals, rats and birds and things like that on the doorstep. But there's the story that I like to tell is I used to have a neighbor that had a dog that would bark so loudly in the middle of the night that it would literally, and so this is a dog that's like 3 yards away. I mean, three houses away, right? Would bark so loud that the windows would shake in my house. And like I said, the dog would see like a cat or something in the middle of the night and would just bark like that for hours. So, so how do you know if there's an externality? Well, it is kind of like the nuisance standard in the sense that if you're willing to pay something to have that thing stop, then you're bearing some damage from it continuing. So that's really where economists cut the line. If if you wouldn't be willing to pay anything to have it stop, then it doesn't affect the costs and benefits in society. Um, so what about positive externalities? Well, positive externalities are a lot more difficult to come up with examples of. And I don't know, does anybody have an example of something that somebody else does that benefits you that you're not involved with? You're just happy that they're doing it, and you get some sort of beneficial effect that you'd be willing to pay for. Can name it? Okay. Um, Esmerai, tell us.
um, I recently moved to an apartment place, but before where I was, my neighbors had this a bunch of trees. They had an apple tree and a lemon tree, and they would give us a bunch of that fruit. And lemons are very, they're
Yeah.
expensive here. So it went up to the point where my parents, when my neighbors went off to some vacation, my parents were willing to take care of their like garden because they were very precise about it.
Okay.
So they were willing to. We didn't necessarily pay for it, but I felt like if you're willing
You
to
were willing
offer these
to.
services to to basically take care of somebody else's things for the benefit of receiving, um, you know,
Yeah,
benefit.
even though you didn't have to pay for it because you just wanted to get something
Yeah.
back. Yeah, and actually, it's not listed here in this slide, but that's you're close to one of the biggest examples that everybody gives, which is I benefit from my neighbor taking care of their house if I live in a neighborhood. So that one's pretty easy, right? Because um, I don't know if you guys have ever been house shopping with your parents or yourself or whatever, but I've been to neighborhoods where I'll drive in and like the house itself that I'm thinking about getting is really nice. But then I'll look next door or a couple doors down and I'll see somebody who, if I bought that house, would be my neighbor, and they've got like 4 cars parked in their front yard and they're up on stilts because they're repairing them, and their house has got paint peeling and all this other stuff. And that's a negative externality, right? On the person who's trying to sell their house, is bringing their property value down. Conversely, right, if you go into a neighborhood and you see all the houses are really nicely taken care of, they got nice gardens and everything like that, well, that's bringing your property value up. You don't have to pay for your neighbors to take care of their property, but if they're good neighbors and they do a good job of taking care of their property, you benefit from that, even though um, you're not directly paying for it. So one of the ones I want to talk about a little bit, a lot of people, I don't know and this has kind of been in the news a little bit more lately. If anybody has ever heard of like an anti-vaxxer, people that are against getting vaccines, I'll tell you, when the coronavirus vaccine comes out, I don't think that there'll be a lot of people who are like, no, no, I don't want that one. But you know, there are people that like traditional childhood diseases like measles and mumps and stuff like that. They don't want to get the vaccines for that. But um, the reason why public health authorities will often subsidize or pay, you can get those vaccines for free or at very low cost, is not because they don't want you to get sick with the measles. It's because if you're vaccinated, then you can't go give it to somebody else. So since coronavirus has kind of taken over what's going on in the news, you guys probably don't have any deep recollection that last year there was a measles outbreak in California, and people were concerned about that. And it was traced back to some kid that had measles because he hadn't been vaccinated, that went to Disneyland. And because there were other people there that weren't vaccinated, they had a little outbreak of measles. And you don't hear about it so much because so many people have been vaccinated. Um, but you know, there are a lot of very serious complications that some people suffer from getting measles. So if I get vaccinated, I'm actually helping other people out because um, I'm not going to be able to transmit the disease to them. So that's a positive externality on other people. One of the other ones we'll talk about, which is pretty common, is research and development of new technologies. Again, it's probably a little bit hard to think about how many of the things that we have today, like whether it be cell phone technology or the microwave oven, but there are lots of other things that we wouldn't have had if they weren't doing research into space flight and exploration. So as a result of NASA's space program, there were all of these technologies that ended up having consumer applications, and those were what you'd call spillovers. And that's another word that they sometimes use for externalities, is that, you know, the NASA space program didn't patent microwave technology, so every time that you buy a microwave, you're sending a little check to them to support space flight. No, what happened is they discovered the technology, and then commercial applications were allowed to use the technology basically for free. And so that means the overall cost to consumers is less than it otherwise would be. It's a benefit, it's a spillover. And a lot of times that happens with research that you might not think about. So this is the really most important slide for you guys to look at. And this is the one that would help you with any sort of problems on Ignithium, that sort of thing, is that the supply curve represents the private costs and the demand curve represents the private value. So it's not taking into consideration any third party costs or benefits. Okay, so those external costs and benefits are not on this diagram as it currently exists. So I'll skip to the next main slide to show you how to introduce an external cost or benefit into this sort of diagram. So this is the case where you have an external cost. And so notice what you do is you add what we'd call the external cost. Here it's labeled as the cost of pollution to the private cost to get the total social cost. So the social cost includes all of society. So it's both the third parties and the private parties that are in the market. So you already have the supplier's private costs in the supply function or the supply curve, and then you add to that the cost of the externality, and you get the total social cost. And then you can see you have this new place where the social cost crosses with the demand curve, and that's what we call the socially optimal or the efficient quantity, right? So the big change here is usually we would identify the equilibrium quantity in the market as being efficient, but that's not true anymore because it's ignoring the social costs. What efficiency is represented by in the market is when there's no external cost. Then you have the social cost and the private cost being equal because there's no additional amount that of cost going on to somebody else. So the private costs are the entire social cost. And so the true idea of efficiency is that efficiency is where social costs and social value are equalized. So when there's this hidden external cost, then we have to look to the place where the social cost crosses with the social value. Now, in this case, there's no additional external force affecting demand. So demand represents the true social value, and social value and social cost are balanced where social cost and social value meet, which is labeled as the optimum here. Okay, so I'll ask if there are any questions about that. No. Okay. So this is to highlight the intersection of the demand curve and the social cost curve determines the optimal level of output. The socially optimal level of output is less than the market equilibrium quantity. In this case, where you have this negative externality, okay, that will be true. With a negative externality, the market will always overproduce. So I'll highlight that a little bit there. See, the market quantity is bigger than the socially optimal quantity. And this is kind of an important point. You know, what economists are after is efficiency. So we don't have these, you know, strict, hard, fast rules that, well, if there's some hidden cost, like a cost of pollution, that means there should be zero pollution. We should just shut down all of the cars and, you know, all of the factories and have zero pollution. No, that's not the answer. The answer is to just make sure we're considering the additional costs on society and make sure that the value you're getting out of it is greater than or at least equal to the costs that it's imposing on society. So in the private market, we don't have to worry about that because the seller is looking out to make sure that all of their costs are covered because they're trying to maximize their profits. But when there's this third party cost like pollution, then government regulators have to somehow intervene in the market and say, hey, listen, you know, the true cost of driving isn't just the cost you pay for gasoline. No, we've got to add some additional tax on there to consider the cost of pollution. And so one area where economists accept that taxes are a solution is in the case of externalities, and we'll get to that in a minute, but I'll just give you guys a little illustration here. So taxing, you know, donuts, for example, or tofu, as we learned before, those will generate deadweight losses. But if you go to the gas station right now and you buy some gasoline, you'll notice there's a little plaque on the side of it, and it says that for every gallon of gasoline you buy, you're paying about 54 cents in tax to the state and federal government. And I think I mentioned that before when we talked about taxes. So it turns out that economists agree, maybe not that 54 cents is exactly right, but that those taxes on gasoline help to account for the additional burden of driving in terms of the pollution that it creates. And so if you guys think about it, what you'll realize is those taxes create a disincentive, right? So Whereas if gasoline prices were really cheap, there's no tax at all, people would just drive around whenever they wanted to, right? Gas is cheap. And I, as a teenager, when I was living in Arizona where we didn't have taxes like that, I remember one time in my senior year, gas was less than 60 cents a gallon. And sure, um, prices and wages were different then, but still that was cheap gas. And we'd fill up our tank for $10 and go drive out into the desert and do whatever. And we never thought about the cost of gasoline. But those were really like unnecessary trips. And if you tax gas a lot, so for example, when I lived in the Netherlands, the price of gasoline then was about $16 a gallon. What, $16 a gallon, right? And most of that was tax. Okay, so that this brings the point home. Most of that $16 was tax, and with gasoline being that expensive, you know, I didn't just drive around whenever I wanted to go wherever I wanted to. If I really was going to go someplace that was very far, most of the time I would hop on a train because it was cheaper. So that's exactly what these differences are. We can justify a tax in a situation where there's a significant negative externality because that's going to discourage people from consuming this good that otherwise would be causing harm to others. So the solution isn't zero of that, zero driving, zero gasoline. The economic solution is to get a tax on there so that people won't really drive very much unless they have a really good reason, right? Unless they're really willing to pay for it. So obviously, ambulance trips in the middle of the night when you're having a heart attack, yeah, that's worth it, right? You don't consider the cost of gasoline then. But if it's just, a day trip to go to, Idlewild or something like that, you were just going to go up there and drink a beer, maybe you don't take that trip because it's too expensive, not because gas is too expensive, but because you taxed it, right? So those types of taxes might be okay. Help us balance social cost and social benefit. So the solution to these externality problems is what we call internalizing the externality, and that involves altering incentives so that people take into account those external effects on the actions of others. So you can achieve this socially optimal output by imposing a tax, for example, and that's the main thing that economists suggest. When there's an external benefit, then instead of a tax, the opposite of a tax is when the government takes money from you. A subsidy is when the government gives money to you. So if you have a positive external effect, then, and here they give the example of a technology spillover, but it could be anything. Like I said, often vaccines are subsidized by the government. And that's because the picture looks more like this, right? So now you've got the private demand for vaccines, let's say, for example. But remember, the height of the demand curve represents the willingness to pay for the private individual. So I'm willing to pay something for, let's say, a coronavirus vaccine, right? If I could get it. But society is willing to have me vaccinated too, because I'm making it less likely that I'll infect other people, not just save myself the hassle of getting the coronavirus. So when the coronavirus vaccine comes out, it's not, whatever the cost is, it's likely that you'll see it for a lower price than the true cost when you go down to CVS, because the government is going to be paying the vaccine producer or maybe CVS, a certain amount of the price of the vaccine so that the cost to the consumer is lower. And why is that? It's because that subsidy is supposed to represent the additional benefit to society from having people that won't transmit the disease to others. I should point out to you guys for a minute, and I'll ask you, why is it the case that if everybody can be vaccinated, and I said if everybody could be vaccinated, that me not getting the vaccine would maybe cause a cost on society, right? Because I mean, like if you don't get vaccinated and I don't get vaccinated, and I get coronavirus and I give it to you, isn't that your problem? Because you didn't get vaccinated. So why is society, getting some general benefit from me not transmitting a disease to other people? I want to just make sure you guys think about this a little bit. Does anybody have an idea? Okay. Let's see. Melody, do you have a mic today?
Yes, I do.
Okay, so help me think through this problem, right? I gave you guys the story that I say, vaccinations generate this positive external benefit, meaning it's a benefit beyond the person that buys the vaccine, right? And so in standard markets for demand and supply, the buyer's willingness to pay, my willingness to pay for me is on the demand curve, and the seller's cost is on the supply curve. But you see the red line here, how it's higher that than the blue line for demand?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, that distance there between the demand and the social value, and that's what we would call the external benefit. That means there's some your willingness to pay is measured in dollars, right? So there's some additional amount of dollars of benefit are going to society if I get vaccinated. How is that? Does it make sense to you?
Well, I guess the external benefit would be, well, if everybody's vaccinated, then nobody would have it. But if someone were to have the disease, like right now with the virus,
Right.
if you're sick, you can't go to work for like 2 weeks or something.
Right.
And so I think it could affect like that. Like maybe if a lot of people are getting sick, you can't go to work and then you can't produce goods and things like that.
Yeah. And actually, so you kind of picked up a little bit on what I was getting at. So I think that a lot of this has to do with, so obviously if I don't get sick, I'm not going to get other people sick, and presumably they're willing to pay something to not get sick, right? Whether they got the vaccine or not, they still don't want to get sick. But there are some people that can't get vaccinated. Did you know that?
No, I didn't know.
Yeah. So like for measles and just every sort of illness that you want to talk about, there's some people that can't get vaccinated. Do you know why? You're like, wow, I didn't know.
No, maybe.
Do you want to take a guess? So does anybody know why some people can't get vaccinated? Okay. Esmerai, why don't you tell us about it?
I did do a research paper on it, and
Another paper.
like 2 years ago. I don't remember much, but I do, because yeah, I was writing about how people who don't vaccinate and the dangers of that, but it's because the vaccination has some sort of, not chemical, but the way they make the vaccinations, it has some sort of You know how people are
Yeah, like if
allergic
you're allergic to eggs, right? You can't get
eggs,
the
right?
flu vaccine, right?
Right. Yeah, people
That's one example.
that's what I was that
Yeah.
basically.
Well, the other thing too is that some people have compromised immune systems, and probably the most tragic case to talk about is some little kid with cancer. And
Mhm.
so what happens in a lot of those cases is people get immune compromised when they go through chemotherapy, because one of the first things they do when they expose people to radiation and chemotherapy is, like people that have leukemia, is they'll kill all of their bone marrow, because the bone marrow is where the cancer is, and the bone marrow also is responsible for helping produce some of the white blood cells and things like that that help their immune system. And if somebody is immune compromised for some reason because they're very sick, and you give them a vaccine, most people, the vaccine is a weakened form of the disease, and their body responds to it and fights it off, creates antibodies, and that's what actually makes them immune, is that they've developed antibodies to the disease. But if you're immune compromised and you get vaccinated, then you get the disease and it kills you, because you don't develop the antibodies. You just die. So being allergic to eggs is one example of some harm that might come from being vaccinated in particular cases. But there are other people, not because they have a sensitivity to the vaccine in particular, but just because they're fighting some other disease and they can't be vaccinated. So to the extent that me getting vaccinated not only prevents me from transmitting the disease more generally and causing people to go out of work and suffer the illness, I'm also helping, and society is willing to pay something, right, to prevent people who might otherwise live and get well or recover from cancer and things like that from being exposed to this disease and dying. And it's not because they're being stubborn, they won't get the vaccine. It's just there's a certain percentage of our population that can't get it. So the only way they'll be protected from the disease is if we all that can withstand the vaccine get it. So the main point is that, yes, getting vaccinated confers a benefit on other people in society, and so instead of taxing it to discourage it, notice here that the equilibrium quantity that the market produces is below the optimal quantity, which means if we don't subsidize vaccines, if everybody has to pay the full cost of vaccines on their own, then you'll get the market equilibrium quantity, which is less than what's socially optimal once we consider the benefits to third parties. So this is, again, a place where the government can do something to subsidize a vaccine. And notice that the answer isn't to vaccinate everyone, it's just to increase the level of vaccinations, so you're making sure that you're accounting for the full benefits to society from getting a certain level of vaccination. Again, the nice thing about economics is it doesn't usually give you a 0-1 type of answer. It's not either, the government's going to pay for everything all the time or zero pollution. It's like, no, we just want to make sure that the benefits are higher than the costs to society, or at least on the margins, what we say equalizing the benefits and the costs. So we're not wasting resources. That's the big picture. So let me go ahead and keep track of my time here. So the intersection of the supply and demand curve is and the social value curve, determines the optimal level of output. The optimal level of output is more than the equilibrium quantity. The market produces a smaller quantity than is socially desirable, and the social value of the good exceeds the private value of the good. So, so now you guys kind of get that. I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing this for just a minute. and pause. I'll resume recording. So, okay, you guys, hopefully here you can see, these are examples from exercise 19, the practice on Ignition. So this is just what we were looking at before. We have a demand curve and a supply curve, right? And then this tells you the external cost. It says 6 per unit. And so you can see, and I just want to point out what normally is relevant, right, are the crossing points here. You can see the market equilibrium there, and then this would be the socially optimal crossing point here, where our external cost is going to be the distance. You can see if you look at the supply curve at 0, it starts at $34 per unit. And if I add 6, it goes to 40. So the purple curve is exactly $6 higher than the supply curve. And so there's our socially optimal quantity. So that's the type of thing you guys want to look for. And here again, the difference is there we were shifting the supply curve upward to show negative externality and increase in social cost. In this next one, it's the demand curve, and the demand curve is being shifted up. And in this problem, it's being shifted up by 12, right? So that means we're going from at 0 units, $108 per unit is the willingness to pay of the buyer that's willing to pay the most for it. But you'll see that the purple curve has an intercept at 0 units of 120, which means that society is willing to pay an additional $12 for whatever this good is that's generating this external benefit. So this is a case of an external benefit. This is a case of an external cost. And again, what you're mostly going to be doing is something to do with comparing the equilibrium and market equilibrium with the socially optimal level of production. Okay. And here's another interesting case. And here, right, they're talking about deadweight loss, and we didn't really talk about deadweight loss in any of the diagrams that we showed. So I just want to run through this example with you really quickly to make sure your eyes are in the right place. So it says we've got demand and supply, and there's this additional external cost. Okay, so where's the deadweight loss? Well, so the deadweight loss is due to overproduction. So you can see the socially optimal level of production where the purple and blue lines cross. And then you can see the market equilibrium level. So the idea is that if you can see this little triangle here, and I can't really annotate this. I wish I could, because the annotation tools are kind of hard to find sometimes. But the main point is there'll be a triangle, and you can see the height of the triangle here. It's the area that's between the purple and the blue line up to, and the base would be where the market equilibrium is. So that, can you guys see my cursor? You can see kind of the triangle that I'm showing you guys there.
Yes.
Okay. So you can find the base of that triangle, and the base might be difficult, but you know that the distance between the two parallel lines is the amount of the externality. In this case, it's 12. So the base is going to be 12, right? And then the height of the triangle is going to be the difference between the socially optimal quantity and the market quantity. So that gives you the 1/2 base times height. And that's what you guys need to focus on. Here, we're talking about a corrective tax. And the corrective tax is equal to the size of the externality. So you guys should be able to, now that I've told you that, work that out. And since we're running low on time, there's just a little bit of time left. I'll ask you guys, do you guys have any questions for me? Okay.
I was kind of curious when the